G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic Monday. I know it can be a rough beginning of the week, but at least you're not having to step out after this video to go and have a round of chemotherapy. But legends, we're in our own war of attrition and we will get through it. Of course, at the end of this week, I'll need to have off a minimum of 3 or 4 days because I'll likely be hospitalised. If you'd like to support me, the channel, all of this, of course, there is links down below, but just you being here and watching through the video, that means the absolute world. Now, legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. And of course, we build on video after video. So there are some things today where I will refer back to yesterday's video. So what we're going to look at is, of course, we'll look at the maps, we'll compare maps, and I'll show you some geolocations. We need to talk about some comments that Trump has made about Putin. And Trump is not really happy with how things are going. But I want to take it a step further because I might be drawing a long bow here, but what we have seen very recently is Zelensky have a 180 shift, Trump have a large sort of shift and attitude change. And what could this actually be telling us about the future on the front line? Because we're seeing a lot of these shifts towards ceasefires and saying, well, Putin's not wanting a ceasefire very quickly and he's trying to draw it out. At the same time, we're hearing that a large offensive is coming. And what may this tell us about the actual situation on the battlefield? We need to look at positions and comments that Trump has also made about Zelensky. He's trying to sit himself as a position of power in the middle here to mediate from power, not from, well, it's neutrality through overpower. But we also need to then look at the effect that further sanctions may have and BRICS, all of this. We need to look at defining winning and what is victorious, what is losing, what is the reality on the front line, and issues that is going to come about where the definitions of that sit. And that is something very important we need to talk about when we're talking about ceasefires and negotiations and potential ends to the war. And of course, the build on yesterday's video, we need to talk about attritional war, but the lasting impact that now is getting accepted. Now, we've known this for over 2 years, but now it's getting accepted. The lasting impact that Bakhmut had and command decisions from Syrskyi there then jeopardized other areas on the front. So we're getting to start here about Trump and Putin and what has been said and what I think could be the reality of the front line of why we have seen such a recent shift. Now, being reported that Trump is very angry with Putin. Trump said he's very angry, pissed off with Russian President Vladimir Putin of attempting to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine. Of course, he's dragging this out. In the interview, Trump said he was angry with Putin for attacking Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's credibility while threatening to impose a 50% tariff on countries buying Russian oil if he did not agree to a ceasefire. Luckily, Trump never then questioned Zelensky's credibility. Trump said, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia. The comments mark a shift in Trump's tone towards Putin and Russia. That's what we're going to talk about. Why have we seen this shift? And as I say here, Trump is trying to position himself into a position of power over both Ukraine and Russia. So he is calling the shots. We're also going to break down how may these sanctions massively backfire if China and India don't play ball. And we see comments just like this. And now this just came into my Telegram. So as I was just about to click film, I saw this. Trump claims Zelensky wants to back out of the minerals deal. We know this minerals deal is very good for America, very bad for Ukraine. He told reporters aboard Air Force One, Zelensky, is trying to back out of the rare earth deal. And if he does that, he's got some problems, big problems. He wants to be a member of NATO, but he's never going to be a member of NATO. He understands that. So we need to take these forward with us too before we analyse further positions as well as what is victorious. What does it mean to define winning? Okay, we'll go over more of what Trump said about Putin. You could say that I was angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility because that's not going in the right direction. Talking about then elections in Ukraine, that new leadership means you're not going to have a deal for a long time. Of course, this is exactly how I've said that Putin plans on dragging this out, is those elections, because Trump has also questioned Zelensky's credibility and his position as the president and all of this as well. And Putin is tapping into something that Trump, we think, agrees on as well, regardless of what he's saying here, to drag this out. And speaking about Putin, Trump said the Kremlin knew of his anger, but noted that he had a very good relationship with the Russian leader, and the anger dissipates quickly if he does the right thing. If Russia does not follow through with the ceasefire, Trump threatened to target its economy further if he thought it was Putin's fault. There will be a 25% tariff on oil and products sold in the US, and secondary tariffs. And secondary tariffs, these are tariffs on countries that do business with another country. They could constitute up to 50% on goods entering the US from countries still buying from oil from Russia. Biggest such buyers by a margin are China and India, of course, members of BRICS. We'll talk about this, don't worry. Zelensky wrote on social media that the interview that Russia continues looking for an excuse to drag out the war. Putin is playing the same game he has since 2014, and that this is dangerous for everyone, and there should be an appropriate response from the United States, Europe, and our global partners. Trump said he would speak to Putin later in the week. But this is where we've come to, and this is where we need to look at the comments made and what has been said here. Now, this is speculation, and I may be drawing a long bow, but I'll put it out to my audience and let me know what you think. And I'm more than happy to be proven incorrect. But we are witnessing a huge shift in stance due to new insights or concerns about the actual battlefield position. Why are we seeing such a rapid shift? Okay, so let's break this down chronologically. Zelensky's overall tone has notably shifted towards being openly pro-ceasefire, despite years of asserting that a ceasefire only benefits Russia. 180-degree shift. Zelensky has increasingly criticised Putin, accusing him of intentionally prolonging the conflict by refusing ceasefire proposals. When mixed with point one here, we see that this has been a dramatic shift. Putin continues to delay the ceasefire agreements, citing the need for conditions to reflect the reality on the ground and or Zelensky's legitimacy. So it's not that Zelensky is wrong that Putin is lengthening this. Putin is definitely doing this as well, but wanting to be from a position of reality, to quote Mr. Lavrov. Okay. Ukrainian commanders have recently publicly voiced concerns, suggesting Russia might be preparing for a significant offensive along several axes across the entire front line. At the same time, Putin noted earlier this week, there are reasons to believe that we can finish them off, referring to the Ukrainian forces. Today, Trump notably backed Zelensky, criticising Putin explicitly for prolonging negotiations and delaying a ceasefire. So we've seen some dramatic shifts in here, as well as warning about new offensives. My conclusion: the critical question arising from these sudden shifts in rhetoric is, why has the tone changed so dramatically and so quickly? Could Trump and Zelensky be reacting to intelligence or military assessments indicating that Putin retains the capacity to launch a large-scale offensive? Such an offensive could prove devastating and significantly strengthen Putin's positions over the next coming weeks or months. This, in turn, would potentially leave Ukraine in an even more precarious state than it currently faces. So trying to get this ceasefire in before Putin has the opportunity to launch that, if he has the capacity to do so. So could this be why I've seen such a big shift? Is no, we need the ceasefire right now, push hard, because they know what then could be coming. Let's talk more about this and look into those sanctions as well. If Putin is preparing a major offensive across the entire front, the threat of sanctions and tariffs might not significantly deter him. If he's able to then amass a significant force, Putin could potentially achieve costly but substantial territorial gains, perhaps even securing a genuine breakthrough somewhere on the front line. And remember the Clausewitzian on-war idea of that warfare is just political through then military means. It's to meet a political goal. That political goal for Putin is Ukraine never joining NATO. That is their goal, not just territorial gains, but of course that is a massive leverage too. Now, why may these sanctions not be a significant deterrence? If this scenario unfolds, it would allow him to substantially improve Russia's strategic position and consequently place Ukraine in a significantly weakened state for future negotiations. Now, considering sanctions, as per as Trump has said, these typically take about a month to actually be effective. Putin may calculate that Russia would only need to endure 2 or 3 months of economic hardship. Afterward, he might anticipate being in such an advantageous position, militarily and diplomatic, that international pressure would shift toward lifting sanctions to facilitate new negotiations, which by then would favour Russia considerably. So he might go, yeah, those sanctions may go through. It may be really rough for 2 or 3 months, but we can hold out for 2 or 3 months because we'll get in such a better position that net overall will be better. Now, let's talk about these sanctions a little bit further. We also need to take into account the secondary sanctions and the relationship between BRICS countries. In this, Russia's relationship with India and China, the ones that have been pointed out exclusively in this of the tariffs because they're buying Russian oil. Now, we need to stop considering these economies or even the countries as backwaters that can be beaten into submission. This is thinking from decades ago, and it is not relevant, and it is stupid, and it will lead us down a very, very bad path. These are huge countries and growing exponentially, incredibly powerful, even just total population. So these three combined is a bit over 3 billion people. 37.2% approximately of the global population. The collective West, everyone in the West, is about 866, so 10%. So they are 3.7%-ish, 3.7 times greater in just population of this also. Now, I have a big video coming on China and their strategic defense and hostile actions as well. So wait out on that. The combined GDP, when we take into account purchasing power parity, Russia, China, India is over $60 trillion. The collective West is 58.6 trillion. Again, what we're dealing with though here is basically we can cut almost Russia out of that when we're talking India, China, because that's where the secondary sanctions will go. We're talking 2 nations with 2 leaders rather than the collective West of over 30 nations, 30 leaders and different. So you can see how that can then, that money can shift into areas much quicker when you're dealing with 2 leaders rather than many, okay? With very different, like where Americans see the world going, to Aussies, to then the Indians in Canada, through to then Western and Eastern Europe is very, very vast, very different trajectories rather than just an India trajectory and China. Trump needs to be very careful that these countries, they choose not to play ball and that they say, well, fine, apply sanctions. We will just not do trade with you. We will continue trade with America or apply the tariff to your own and we'll keep going. As I've stated, Putin will push for BRICS for de-dollarization. China, they will only work with the USD as long as it suits them. China's relationship with the West is as long as it benefits China, they will continue that. And that's why we see there is diplomatic maneuvering. The USD does not have the power that it used to have. And this could backfire and further cement these economies together. So things like this, maybe these countries will go, right, well, now it is the time to make those moves because now it is not favourable for us to have relations with the US and the USD. So there is a tightrope here being walked. I see the surface level benefit, but what if these countries, China and India, as I've shown you the power that they now have, just choose not to play ball, the backfire that can have on the US, which is of course underpinned by the USD, and the West is underpinned ultimately by the USD too. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what actually happens here. Now, further on this, but in a different sort of thing, before we get into defining victory, this Financial Times article, Ukraine's ceasefire to increase Russian threat in the Baltic region. The defence ministers have warned. So this is a couple of the first paragraphs, then I'll go through my breakdown. A ceasefire in Ukraine will dramatically increase security threat to Baltic nations, as Russia will proceed with plans to rearm and redeploy troops to NATO's north and east flank. This is from regional defence ministers. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania which were annexed by the Soviet Union before regaining independence in the 1990s, are worried that Moscow will not stop at Ukraine once the Trump administration brokers a ceasefire. The Baltic nations point out that the Kremlin has already laid out plans for increased military production and additional troops along their borders. We all understand that when the war in Ukraine will be stopped, Russia will redistribute its forces very quickly. This is from the Estonian defence minister, has told the Financial Times. That means also the threat level will increase significantly very quickly. Funnily enough, these countries here, a lot of them, have stated about Russia's strategic defeat and inability to then do this. But we're seeing more and more true colours being seen, and that the Baltics, they want to keep the war going to weaken Russia, not strengthen Ukraine or the best position for Ukraine. They will do what they can for Ukraine to, though, weaken Russia. That is their primary goal. Their primary goal is not the best for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. The goal is what actions do we need to take to weaken Russia? And if that is strengthening Ukraine on the battlefield, so be it. Doesn't matter at the cost of that. Now, I find this disgusting because this is very simple. These nations are protected under Article 5 NATO. Russia has shown no ability to be able to take on NATO. They have not shown the ability conventionally to take on NATO. Russia has shown no political will, societal will to do this either. So what this is based on is troops that are going to be redeployed along a border, just like we have redeployed troops along many borders from nearing China to nearing Russia to wherever else. That doesn't mean that they're there to cross in because of these aspects right here. They make the claim that Russia is willing and able to take on NATO while saying that Ukraine, with a few more $1 billion, will be able to defeat Russia. These are mutually exclusive. If Russia is willing and able to take on NATO conventionally, a few more $1 billion to Ukraine, given the situation, is not going to stop an army that would have to be that powerful to do so. So this is the two buttons with Russia strategically defeated and Russia has the ability to take on NATO and Ursula von der Leyen fucking sweating. These countries, they see more benefit in Ukraine being engaged in a losing war as long as it weakens Russia, more than wanting the best realistic outcome for Ukraine and its citizens. I bet even if Ukraine could make it to their 1991 borders, they've pushed through Crimea, they've pushed through Donetsk, they're back at the border, that these pricks would then say, well, to stop Moscow redeploying forces, they must push to Moscow, otherwise we are still at threat. Again, you need to see where priorities actually sit. And I think a lot of the informational priority is hating Russia more than loving Ukraine. I think that's where a lot of people sit in the informational space because I go, that is coming from a point of hating Russia, not a point of what is the best for the people that you claim to be so defending. So let's go over this defining winning before we get then into the maps. And Mr. Tatarigami UA makes, of course, another appearance on this channel. One of the biggest problems of this war is that Ukraine and the West haven't clearly defined what winning looks like. This has allowed the Russians to present the Istanbul agreements as the only negotiation framework due to the absence of a well-defined alternative. Now, this right here, defining winning, this is a topic you and I have spoken a lot about, and I actually disagree with Mr. Tatarigami here. I think Ukraine has too clearly defined what winning is, and that anything less than that definition is in turn losing. Defined 1991 borders, nothing less. NATO, nothing less. EU, Putin arrested, and Russia pays for the rebuilding of Ukraine. These are very clear definitions. The issue that I've raised is due to these being so clear, what happens if that doesn't happen? If it's clear that 1991 borders is the only thing, if Russia control a square kilometre somewhere, then you can say that that was a failure. Now, of course, that's an extreme example. I don't actually believe that, but you can see what I'm getting at. Where Russia, on the other hand, they have had a far less measurable goal. And this is then easier to sell a victory to society. You can very easily measure Ukrainians' territorial ambition in just kilometre squares. But how do you measure demilitarization? How do you measure denazification? These are subjective, and you can make an argument either way on these, and you could argue that these have been achieved, which Russia is making that argument. So take demilitarization, for instance. What the argument is that now that Ukraine is solely reliant on Western arms, they have been demilitarized of their arms previous to then the 2022 invasion. That is how you can frame that. But C, you can make a counter argument, or it's actually more powerful due to the better weapons at this point in time. But again, this thing that is difficult to measure is an easier sale, if that makes more sense. The only black and white goal that Russia has, but is also priority number one, is Ukraine in NATO. And this is increasingly unlikely, especially with Mr. Trump in the White House. The victory plan presented by Zelensky is not a true negotiation framework, and it didn't resonate with the previous administration, let alone the current White House administration. If it didn't work for Biden, it's not going to work on Trump. Of course, there are alternative options, such as Russia retreating to 1991 borders. The problem is, Russia won't do that, and there is no realistic enforcement mechanism short of NATO intervention. The US isn't about to bomb Russia. This raises the question, what does a desired outcome based on the realities of the ground actually look like? And this is where so many people are glossing over this at the moment. What actually is the best desired outcome given the realities on the ground, and given that, sorry, leaders of the EU, Russia is not just going to turn around and go, oh, fuck, our bad, back to the border, boys. That's not going to happen at this point in time. And militarily, can that occur from Ukrainian pressure? We are unsure, likely not. Zelensky has said that won't happen under military pressure. Can it happen under sanctions? Well, we've been told for years that it's going to. We'll get into that. Ukraine won't accept capitulation demands, not only because they are unacceptable, but also because the government lacks the authority to do so. Under Article 73 of the Constitution, the issues of altering the territory of Ukraine are resolved exclusively by an all-Ukrainian referendum. So how do you do this? Very difficult. Trump's suggested plan is simplistic, aiming to end the war quickly at any cost without long-term consideration or guarantees for what happens after he leaves office. That Ukraine has no actual plan, and the Russians' plan is unrealistic. But what I say is, if we look at where the plans are, let's go 10-point peace plan. Let's go where Lavrov and Putin have put out, ideas of where this may end. Where is closer? Where are we along this graph at the moment? We are far closer to that being put in place than the other way. We're 115,000 square kilometres closer to this. Europe is talking about deploying troops, but this is just political yapping. Who would have thought? For a plan to work, an army-sized EU force needs to be on the front line, ready to respond with force to Russia if it violates the truce. Europe isn't ready. Thus, these talks aren't serious and can be ignored. And of course, all of this, to my knowledge, backs on US ceasefire and US backstop of support. There are no significant positive changes on the horizon regarding aid. No realistic peace plan. Europe remains unwilling to make meaningful action. Even if Russia exhausts its steam, it won't automatically free occupied territories. And just as we have said, what if Russia chooses to not be on the offensive and they just dig in? They do a 2023. They go, right, we're running out of steam on man or machine or XYZ. Okay, we'll just dig in again and set up a massive defensive line. What then occurs there? They're not just going to walk out, given the cost that they have put into this. Overall, given these factors, I remain skeptical that peace will be reached in the coming weeks or months. As I wrote last year, I anticipate some form of truce this year or early next year, but there is still no peace framework in sight or commitment from Europe to uphold it. And then we go over the typical speaking points. And Tashragama Yue, he breaks these down well. So from an account here, how many times does Ukraine have to say that all Russians out of pre-1991 territories? And this idea that as long as Russia can just turn around and walk out. And Tashragama Yue says very similar to what I've been saying. I can say I need $10 million in my bank account right now. I can say it 1,000 times, but that doesn't make it realistic or likely to happen. It's just a childish and unserious conversation, and I could not agree more with that. Yes, it's nice, but it's just idealistic. Is it realistic? Given the cost Russia has put into this war of the minimum of, say, 90 to 100,000 guys have died, maybe more, billions or trillions of dollars potentially over the full length of impact from sanctions to military, they're not just going to turn around and walk out. If Putin suggests that, well, you can just walk out of here, that would be seen as just as, of course, ridiculous. Other gentleman here says sooner or later Russia would retreat for 3 reasons. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. Of course, we've been hearing this for a long time. Mr. UA says, "We'll consider for a moment that your assumption might be wrong. What happens then?" And this is something we have been talking about a lot. What happens if that doesn't then occur? What happens if Russia's not willing to do this? What happens then? What is the real plan right now to make change? Okay? And Mr. Tataragami UA says, well, there's not one, and that is a huge concern. So let's have a look on the maps. And I want to talk about a little bit of doctrine. But here's Ukraine, the centre. Here's the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, purple since 14. And of course, we have an area down in here of Bakhmut. And of course, we can see where Ukraine had its counteroffensives by some of this remaining green in here. Of course, we have areas like to the south of Kyiv, and at one point we can see where's Velika Novosilka down in here, and areas such as Staromorsky that have then been turned back around. But there's a few things I want to talk about in this, because we've been talking about doctrine and the inability to accept the phase of attritional warfare having huge then effect, and how you set up from years ago to be in the situation you are. Protracted warfare has to be holistic view of push and pull, cause and effect long term, not just tactical actions. Okay? New York Times said the 2023 Southern counteroffensive was undermined by Syrsky's desire to take back Bakhmut. US officials who were cited have said that Syrsky has also called for newly trained brigades to be used in the south, keeping experienced brigades for Bakhmut. And this is exactly what we spoke about yesterday, as Mr. Tataragami UA mentioned. We're going to go over exactly what was said there. But decisions made, these affect future actions. Russia's late 22-23 decisions, or late 22 into 23 decisions, regarding sitting in defence, mobilisation, recruitment, that made their offensives in 24 possible. The West forcing Ukraine into a counter-offensive for which it was not ready in 2023 led to the situation we now see in 24-25. This is long-term. Tactics, short-term individual battles. Strategy, the art of war, is long-term impacts over. In protracted war, you're talking years, and that this is no different, that Bakhmut jeopardised offensives down around Melitopol and other areas. As we touched on yesterday, this was due to not accepting, and still not accepting, that this is attritional protracted war, and the idea that skill and manoeuvre are going to be the reasons to win on the battlefield, rather than trying to meet the goals you need to as an all-over force for attritional warfare over a number of years. And if you want to see this, well, this is exactly what I spoke about yesterday. And I'll just present this and say which country did this and which one didn't. Okay, so first, ranges your initiation of hostility. Until then, you reach an area, then you slow down, that there's going to be very little positional shifting. That the main form of combat is then fires, artillery, planes, guns, bombs, things like this. Then you build extensive fortifications and camouflage while you mobilise forces to replace your losses and increase the size of your force. This takes 2 years to do, okay? Once that is done, you're doing through fires, you're mobilising more guys, you've dug in. That over that sort of 2 year period. Then you start the second phase. You can start offensives because you've got newly mobilised forces. You have to then exhaust or lower your enemy's strategic reserve. You have superiority in fires and reconnaissance, and you've degraded their industrial sector. You can't launch the secondary phase of offensives until you've met these. You can only do this after you've met the criteria, and then you launch across a broad front to overwhelm it at many different points until you have a breakthrough. So, who did this? I can tell you that Ukraine did not do this before the 2023 counteroffensive because it was pushed in by the West to show bang for buck of the money. If we look at this attrition, in my opinion, Russia has followed the bouncing ball completely to this since the failures through 22 to then being back on the front foot in 24, and the timeframes and the goals of reaching these have all then matched up. Now, speaking further of Bakhmut, I want to share this complete thing from Tataragami UA to speak of exactly one of the informational outcomes we speak of. Propaganda is a double-edged sword. It started working against Ukraine, making self-reflection harder when the situation in Bakhmut was deteriorating. And our team was informed that casualty rates in close quarters weren't anywhere near these 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 ratios that some officials and analysts claimed. It became obvious that propaganda was getting people killed. It downplayed how bad things were and delayed the decision to withdraw from semi-encirclement. Essentially, propaganda started to cover leadership mistakes, making them feel a lack of accountability for their decisions. No matter what, the mantra was the same. Trust the Ukrainian forces and trust the command there. And now we're seeing some of this now pop up multiple years later. It was incredibly frustrating for me. I had phone calls with people on the ground who told me that they couldn't evacuate the wounded. They're lying there for hours, rotting, stuck with tourniquets so long they were losing limbs. The roads to Bakhmut, these were under Russian fire control. There was no available evacuation. Meanwhile, internet experts were talking about how Ukraine needed to hold the city at all costs and even send in more troops into the semi-encirclement. I have to say, I received a lot of hate from the pro-Ukrainian community for sounding my concerns as they say I was dooming, which was especially funny given the hate was mostly coming from people that have never been to Ukraine. And see, this in here can then affect to cover leadership mistakes. Bakhmut could have been a moment for reflection, a case study in why Ukraine needs to adjust certain approaches, even if you're trading casualties at 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. When the enemy has 3 to 4 times the population and is sending in yesterday's prisoners against patriotic, motivated professional soldiers, your best soldiers, as we can see in this one here, that Syrskyi then held, keeping experienced fighters for Bakhmut and newly trained brigades for the south, that's not a win. Some self-reflection was needed badly, but nobody heard my concerns about future manpower problems at that time. But that discussion was buried under the successes of 2022 campaigns in Kharkiv and Kherson, along with the excitement leading up to summer 2023, and we saw how that then went. So let's quickly belt feed the maps and have a look at what is moving. So firstly, let's step up then into Kursk. Now, this still hasn't caught up on the geolocation of the Russian flag going up right here, and we have just on the outskirts here what would be considered red, not grey at this point in time, I believe. At Gogolevkia here, we have a Russian VDV flag being flown from always traffic noise, being flown in this video we see here. So this area completely then bombed out, and you can see that flag then going up. So we can confirm definite movement up to this area, and that the blue has probably been pushed back, because if it's right here they're putting up, I'd likely say it's further back than this. So let's then move into the northeast, where we have seen Russia make significant gains according to Syriac map over the past 24 hours, and over the past 24 it's been no different. Did I say 48? I meant 48, and over the past 24 we've seen more. So let's then bring this up here. So we need to be looking for the areas where the roads are sitting. So this is Dovrychnya in here. We can see where these roads are coming out, and Zapadne. We can see that he's saying that the Russians have come up and crossed this road where this big bend is, and as well in the middle from Dovrychnya are making more ground along the centre of this road and sort of meeting those up. You can see where this field is then this field in this locality. So keep an eye on this front line. Of all front lines I'm concerned of, it goes to the south and then here. So let's move our way down, and we can see out from Terni, we talked about that Syriac was showing the same movements to the northwest as Deep State, but he was showing it was far fatter. And we have seen towards Katanivkia, this spire that had come out, that the Russian forces have then fattened this as well. So let's continue moving our way down, and what we see is we come into eastern Pokrovsk, Sukabalka front line. We can see an advancement here. Now, Syriac maps, he's saying that this looks more something like this. But what we can get from this, even if they look different, is we know there was definite movement in this area on the front line. How much? We don't know, but we know there was definitely movement. Now, Pokrovsk front, Kotlene Udashny area. Just keep an eye on this front for a minute, then we'll move our way down. We can see from the Syriac maps that he's showing on this front that Ukraine did push back some sectors towards Solone, which is in here, and out from Udashne as well. You can sort of line up where some of these roads are, and as well across the train line into Kotlene. And then further down to the south in here, then we get into Zaporizhia, Sreberne, and down towards like Andriivkia, we can see that he is saying a lot of this is then filling in. So let's zoom in just a little bit, and we can see then where areas like Kotlianivka is, so you can see this, and a filling in out of Srebrenica as well. So just keep an eye. There's a lot of changes on these maps, but if the war ends, we'll get an idea, because things are going to actually have to give us an idea. Now, the Russian time travelers in here have then split up into 5 separate elements, from the singular to then the several. Interesting tactic. Realistically, we then see this, that this is Rozliv, and that there is a Russian push in here. Which makes more sense? This. Which is most likely? Probably this. Occam's razor, what seems like the most likely, it probably is that way. If you see hoof prints and you're out in the middle of Australia, you think horse. You don't think fucking zebra. So let's then look around the south, Lubkovi, Stepovi, Shkabaki area, where we have seen a lot of changes being claimed by Suryak. So today is on the east. So we have Shkabaki here, and then this is in this sector down around here. Now let's try and line up then some things. The paddocks and stuff, of course, are all sitting a little bit differently. But let's have a look. See where these 3 paddocks are. I believe this is then these 3 paddocks. So it's in this area, running up in here, and then across down this creek line in here. So wait out on confirmation of that. Legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day. I've got to go have this drug. I'm probably a bit late. I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.